This paper came out of my reflection during the pandemic. And so the overseas foreign workers, or OFW, are the 2 million plus contractual and migratory Filipino workers who are employed by foreign countries and companies globally. The OFW seek employment beyond the confines and comfort of their homeland because they have perceived that the income they could earn in certain foreign nations and companies are more lucrative. With the higher income that they have earned, they usually send a large portion of that income back home to their families in the form of remittance. The OFWs work in various industries such as service, medical, domestic, and trade. And their remittances to their families are considered one of the most important sources of Philippine national income and foreign currency. And yet, their ubiquity is unseen. They are the backbone of the Philippines and of many nations. They are called bayani, or heroes, by the Philippine government. But when the pandemic struck in 2020, the Philippine government was slow in their response in assisting them. They were left to fend for themselves at their host nations after they were forcefully terminated from their jobs. I read the Gospel of Mark with and through them because I have a lot of friends who are OFWs. I actually grew up in the Philippines. As a biblical scholar, this is my way of acknowledging and thanking and supporting their cause, their sweat and labor. Among many possible ways, the pandemic triggered me to rethink about the struggle of the OFWs, the Minjung, the Ochlos, as manifesting in Gospel of Mark. Now, the question is, why Minjung? Why Minjung again? Isn't Minjung Korean laborers? Yes and no. Yes, Minjung has its roots in Korean theology and experience, as An Byung-moo and other Minjung theologians have shared with us. But also no. Actually, An Byung-moo, according to his memoir, compiled and translated by Hana In and Wongi Park, never defines or limits Minjung to one group or people, and actually expresses Minjung as sites of struggle, wherever it is, where the exploitative systems manifest against the poor and the oppressed. In other words, Minjung is less of a person or a persona, but of an event that transcends, but ironically, experiential as well. So it's less of who, but more of when, where, and how. Speaking of, I think a lot of us have watched the show. A good example of this is the character named Ali Abdul in the famous Netflix TV series called Squid Games. It was in 2021. And this show actually tapped into the emergence of Minjung by having a character by the name of Ali Abdul, player 199. I will not spoil it for anyone who hasn't watched it yet. A Pakistani OFW working in South Korea. Ali represents the thousands of foreign workers who are trying to make a living in South Korea so that they could support their families back home. Ali is also the unfortunate recipient of neo-colonial abuse tendencies of his Korean employers. Now, I have to talk about the Bible because as a biblical scholar, I have to do this. Now, the feeding narratives of Mark, chapter 6, verse 33 to 44, I find as exceptionally good narrative to expound upon what I call the OFW hermeneutics. Here, I argue for a three-step narrative flow. First, the OFWs travel. There's this travel in order to find hope. Second, they engage the host community or individual either through work, conversation, or whatever it is. And the third step is they return, or they were forcefully sent back to their home community with their remittances or their hope or their help. I see this narrative flow with the Ochlos of Mark, the Minjung of today. And interestingly, in the Greco-Roman world, there are a lot of examples, cases of such seasonal and migratory workers as well. So Mark was not inventing anything like that. Here, please note that this three-step narrative flow of OFW hermeneutics that I am proposing is not a scientific method that applies to every narrative that you find in Gospel of Mark. Rather, my reading is a pastoral response in assisting the OFWs to see, read, and manifest themselves in the Gospel of Mark. I do not consider Mark as a cipher text in which we could find a formula that could decode our narratives. My OFW hermeneutics is definitely not the key or some kind of a formula in reading the Gospel of Mark. Rather, my hope is to speak, write, and read the Gospel of Mark in ways that will create a space that was barely created for the OFWs. They're everywhere, and yet we have not given them that much time and space. So here's how I read Mark chapter 6, 30 through 44. For the first step, the great crowd, the Ochlos, verse 34, traveled from all over the towns to meet Jesus and his disciples. And we have a lot of narratives in Gospel of Mark where people travel to meet Jesus or the host individual or community. Then the second step, the Ochlos or the crowd, sought after Jesus in order to find hope, and Jesus responded to the crowd by teaching or giving them many things on certain things. The narrative continues after Jesus taught them. The narrative continues into the night. As we all know, the hour is very late and the crowd are getting hungry and tired. And so the disciples of Jesus encouraged them to go away. But Jesus said that we need to feed them. They were able to find 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, blessed them, broke them, and gave it to the crowd. So whether you believe that this was a miracle or a simple manifestation of sharing of food, an OFW hermeneutics would first see this as a miraculous event because they were fed fully one way or another, because this is what they were looking for in the first place. However, the third step, I would say, is the most important for the OFW hermeneutics. Verse 43 informs us that there were 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. A usual interpretation of this 12 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish is that, this is just tangential information, a story of completion, and so on and so forth. An OFW hermeneutics, though, find this information, the leftover, as the crucial conclusive event in the narrative. Like the modern day OFWs, I'm arguing that these 12 baskets are remittance or food to be brought home. Their search and engagement with Jesus is not just for them to be fed, but they also want to bring hope and help back to their homes. And for this presentation, I'm limited with time, so I can't really give other examples. But there are a lot of passages in Mark where actually Jesus would send them back home with certain hope or help that they found with Jesus. And here, I also said in my PowerPoint that this leftover or this remittances remind me of this Korean expression called sallim or living, in which the encounter of Jesus or with Jesus is about creating life. Theology against necropolitics and against the exploitative systems. I say so because when Jesus encountered the Ochlos in one occasion, Jesus called the Ochlos or the people, the Minjung, as his family. And the Korean word for that is shiku. And shiku also means food mouth. In other words, in Korean and Filipinx culture and other cultures as well, when you eat together, it's family. When you eat together, there are a lot of important gatherings and talk. And like what our previous presenter said, Anthony, in that kitchen table, there are a lot of liberation and healing events that also happens. And in my longer paper, I would talk more about that. Now, here's the thing, though. My OFW hermeneutics also invites a pause or a critical take on the conditions of the OFWs and the dangers of saviorism. I acknowledge that the Markan Jesus likes to dismiss the crowd or even abuse them. That is why I argue that Jesus is on the one hand part of the Minjung, and also on the other, he is occupying the space of the host or the exploitative power nations company. Just to give one example, Jesus calls upon the crowd in chapter 7, verse 14, when he needs their mob support. When Jesus was being questioned by the Pharisees and scribes, Jesus reached out to the crowd and said, "Please be my buffer." We also see this mixed personalities, mixed reactions of the crowd toward Jesus in chapter 14, verse 43 and 15:11. Now to conclude, in as much as I want to uplift the OFW's condition in every possible way, I also have to be honest and critical by revealing the colonial underbelly of this movement, of this phenomenon. And as Jim said also, there is this colonial capitalist, global capitalism underlying this whole movement. In many cases, the OFW do not always return with a heartwarming narrative. This three-step, sometimes and many times, stop with the first step. Like how the oppressed are crucified on the cross, Joanna de Mafelis was murdered by her employer in 2018. We say her name and the names of other OFWs who were crucified in the name of finding help, hope for their families and communities. Joanna left, fulfilled the first step. She tried to fulfill the second step by working hard in her host nation. However, she was murdered and her second and third step were canceled. And so I follow Unju Christine Pe, her call to invoke the presence of the oppressed and especially invisible women in the Ochlos or the crowd movement. Pe admonishes that the invisible women and the invisible others in the Markan narrative should be loved, healed from violence and alienation, and uplifted from their invisibility. And so I conclude by saying, we remember Joanna de Mafelis. Thank you very much.
The migrant workers, this COVID-19 has brought so much, this big invisible community, which you have so rightly brought out, that they were the backbone of our economy, but they were so invisible until this pandemic. And even the pandemic didn't bring out. We just saw we just saw the tip of the iceberg of the issues that they were suffering all throughout, though they were the backbone through the centuries. And this example rightly brings out, even in India, we see the migrant workers issues were so much spotlighted and highlighted throughout the social media that we thought like it was an eye-opening thing, because as you said, some of them never went back to their homes. Like in between, they lost their lives, or when they went home also, there were no people to receive them, because they were now in India. We had some pictures of where they had to spend time outside their homes, where they were seen very risky and dangerous because they were coming from a alien place. So in their own homes, they were not accepted, and in the home place, in the place they had made their home, that also were not their home now. So they were in between. So very rightly you have brought out, and this OFW hermeneutics, overseas workers hermeneutics, it's so much, it need to be applied so much. And Ochlos theology, where Jesus reaffirms life, send back people with extra food. They have food to take. So it is not, so I don't have questions as such, but then it is highlighted the problems all around this, so that our theology will be arising from issues that had so long been invisible. And our questions will be these invisible issues have been brought out, and only then the theology will be well articulated. Thank you so much. And yeah.